Good evening, everyone, and welcome to GV Art. Most of you know, but I'll say it anyway, I'm Robert Derchik. I'm the founder of the gallery. And GV Art is primarily a contemporary art gallery that focuses on art and science collaborations. And I had the pleasure of meeting Susan only a couple of years ago, and we came across each other's paths because lots of other artists were talking about Susan and her work. But it was Nicholas Humphreys, who was just finished writing a book on consciousness called Soul Dust, and Susan did the front cover image for the book. And Nicholas was looking for somewhere to launch the book. So we started a conversation about a book launch that turned into an exhibition, which led to Susan and I striking up a friendship, which then meant that Susan was part of our Brainstorm exhibition, which opened 2nd of December 2010, and I think the Soul Dust show followed straight after that. And then we had an art and science show last summer, which Susan was part of that group show, and then we had Trauma more recently, and now Polymath. So in less than 2 years, we've had the pleasure of including Susan in 5 exhibitions. And tonight, Susan's going to talk about inspiration. And I have the pleasure of introducing you to Susan. And what we're going to do is, Susan will do her presentation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll stop for 5 minutes so you can all have refreshments, and then we'll do a Q&A session for about 15-20 minutes if you all want to. Can I just ask you all to switch off your mobile phones and put them on silent, and then hand you over to Susan.
Thank you. Actually, the first time Robert and I met, we were talking about this Soul Dust show, and he said to me, "Well, I'm not looking to represent anyone," and I said, "Well, I'm not looking for representation." So just to show you, have to be very careful what you say
and now
sometimes.
we're exclusively mutual.
But tonight I'm going to talk a bit about my work. I'm not going to talk about all of it because I think there's a time limit on it. I've suddenly got obsessed with this word muse. It's a very sort of unfashionable word. And as Ruth was saying to me earlier, it's a very masculine word. A muse is usually a woman to a man. I hadn't thought of that before, but I'll think on my feet and see how it works with what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about different sorts of muses. And I'm not going to try and define it because I always get stuck on that sort of thing. We can talk about that maybe afterwards. I'm very ideas-led as an artist. I took a degree in philosophy before I studied fine art. And I think I always need to be chasing something. I think it's how I work. I'm hugely curious about the world, particularly human beings. And one of the things I'm really chasing at the moment is I'd just love to know what it feels to be somebody else. So those are the sort of territories I'm going to take us on in this talk tonight. I'm going to talk about the brain as muse. I'm going to talk about neuroscience as muse. I'm going to talk about collaborative practice, master printers as muse. I'm going to talk about the human condition as a muse. And I'm going to talk about process. Process, for me as an artist, is an extraordinarily important thing. It's the relationship between form and content, the relationship between what my work's about and how I make it. And to me, the success of a piece of work is always about how it's made and what it looks like. The ideas are important, but I think probably the process is more important to me. A small bit of history. I got interested in the brain through a rather horrible incident, which I always feel I should talk about just because it's part of my history, but I'll do it very quickly. I ended up collapsing in my studio 10 years ago because there was too many white spirits in the air, and I ended up on a hospital operating table about to have a brain scan, thinking I probably had a brain hemorrhage and that I might well not get over it. But in fact, there was, as ever, nothing much wrong with me. And I also write a lot. Keeping a written diary is an incredibly important part of my process of working. And this is one of the things that I wrote, which just really tells you what it all felt like. You were lying on a bed looking up at your brain scan live on a bank of monitors. You were seeing the inside of your brain with your brain. You were thinking about what you were seeing with what you were seeing on the screen. You are looking inside your head whilst thinking, seeing, feeling. Your brain is working whilst you are looking inside it. It is some sort of philosophical conundrum, the mind-body problem literally illustrated. But where is the me in all this? And that was just a raw reaction to seeing this image. This is actually my brain scan, which I traced down. And to be honest, until that moment, I'd really just thought of myself as an outside surface. I'd not, I was very aware that I woke up vaguely the same person every morning. And I was very aware what it felt like to be me, but I hadn't really connected it with this thing inside my bony skull. And so I then had to think, how do I find out about this? So I approached the guy who'd done the brain scan on me and said, can I come and be the artist in residence? And he said yes. And that was a totally illegal but marvellous thing to do. I worked in a London hospital in the neuroimaging department for about 3 years, drawing other people having brain procedures, going to open brain surgery and getting to understand, as a physical object, the brain. I also met a wonderful writer called Paul Brooks, and this is what he writes about the brain. Look inside, 3 pounds or so of jellified fats, proteins and sugars packed into the bony box of a skull, numb and dark as a tomb. But look at the spirit summoned up from the sludge. Look at the carnival of consciousness that flows from the void. How is this possible? Or as I used to say to my dear friend Kaz, thinking flesh. It always makes her laugh. And there it is. For you who are squeamish, I won't leave it up there too long. So this object has become a muse. What is consciousness? How does it emanate from this flesh? I was working in these hospitals, and my tools of work there were just drawings, pens, papers. I was very lucky to be able to work there. And looking at an object doesn't mean you necessarily understand it. Looking at an object gives you a physical relationship with it. But what I could never forget was that the object was always inside someone's body. I was looking at their brain, but it was someone's life. And I very much wanted to capture in my work, not the brain simply as an object, but the brain as the person. And I was looking at them on an operating table. I'm just trying to find some images for you. So I was sat there at my table, they're lying on the operating table having these brain scans. I had permission to be there because I'm very, very careful about the people I work with. And I'm watching them. All of them have had some trauma to their brain. They might not wake up the same person. So I was fortunate enough to be able to sit there and look and wonder about human consciousness. So here's my second muse, human consciousness. My question was, what turns matter into imagination? This idea of a soul doesn't make much sense to me. I'm a fallen Catholic. But I held my father last year, and he died in my arms suddenly. And the difference between him being alive and him dead in that moment was hugely profound. And it's why I always sort of chase this idea of the soul. I like these little stories as well. I thought they'd be quite amusing. 21 grams. In 1907, Dr. Duncan McDougall weighed 6 patients while they were in the process of dying from tuberculosis in an old age home. It was relatively easy to determine when death was only a few hours away, and at this point, the entire bed was placed on an industrial-sized scale, which was apparently sensitive to the gram. He took his results, a varying amount of perceived mass loss in most of the 6 cases, to support his hypotheses that the soul had mass, and when the soul departed the body, so did this mass. The determination of the soul weighing 21 grams was based on the average loss of mass in the 6 patients within hours or minutes of death. So in a way, that's slightly absurd science, but it's a sort of science I quite like. And in a way, my chasing consciousness, although I do it often through neuroscience and talking to other people, is probably as bonkers as that. This is one of the first drawings I did of a woman in the operating table. It's very conventional. I'm very unsure as an artist. I'm used to working in a studio on my own. It's very exciting to be in somebody else's working place. Then I found out another fact about this weight, the soul. East German researchers in 1998 weighed more than 200 terminally ill patients just before and immediately after their deaths. In each case, the weight loss was exactly the same, 1/3000th of an ounce. The inescapable conclusion is that we have now confirmed the existence of the human soul and determined its weight, Dr. Becker writes. However, a clergyman was heard to say at that time, it's ironic that communist scientists could conduct a search for the soul, much less declare they found it, said one priest. So, the challenge before us, said the scientist then and for me, is to find out exactly what the soul is composed of. And for me, the soul is shorthand for consciousness. So I worked in these operating theatres, drawing cautiously to start with, and then starting to use colour as a way of remembering that not only was I looking inside someone's brain, but that the brain was the person. The relationship between the physical brain and the sense of self was something in the process of what was going on there. Again, a reference to my diary. I still cannot escape the thought that I'm seeing all this and thinking all of this because of the very thing I'm looking at. The brain is a strange and marvellous thing. Although it is flesh, it is not like a heart or a kidney or a bowel. It is thinking flesh. September the 14th, 2004. A 4-year-old boy, Charlie, arrives for a coiling in his head. He has been complaining of hearing Martians talking, and his mother thinks he is becoming a little deaf. From a previous angiogram, they have found a large lump at the base of his head. The result is that he hears voices. The room is suddenly full of people, and I feel uncomfortable behind my screen like a voyeur. The little child loses it. I don't want the gas in my face, he screams over and over again. The fear builds up in us all. The father, stronger than his struggling son, is torn between going through with the operation and following his instincts to take the child in his arms and run. Finally, he forces the boy onto the operating table, where the anaesthetist puts the gas over his cries. I don't know whether it's attention, but suddenly yellow seems an important colour in this work. So what I'm trying to explain through this is that as an artist working in somewhere like a hospital, you're very much trying to record what's going on, trying to think what you're trying to do. And what I ended up with was a whole bunch of drawings. And then the problem is, what do you do with them? I'd started playing with watercolour and making these very colourful drawings which showed the structure of the brain and then also showed for me, the colour became the human being, the person inside the brain. But I had thousands of drawings and I was very unsure what to do. So fortunately, I met a master printer. I'm an etcher, quite a radical etcher, as well as a filmmaker, but I'm not going to talk about my films at all today. This is a guy called Nigel Oxley, who worked at some of the best print studios, commercial print studios in Britain in the 1970s and 80s. And he now works at London Metropolitan University, where he worked with me and gave me a research fellowship. What I wanted to do was find a way of changing the drawings into works of art that had meaning for me. This is the very first piece of work I did. It's called Between a Thing and a Thought, which is a sentence borrowed from the artist Samuel Palmer when he was talking to William Blake about the brain and what it might be. It's taken from a scan of my own brain, and what I'm trying to do there is show that this is all my world is. It's referring very literally to a brain scan, but I think it's trying to bring in this idea of the wider world out there. So we have all these drawings. You can even find beauty in a brain tumour. And then Nigel and I decided I wanted to find a way of capturing consciousness in an etching. one of the things I like to do is work incredibly hard, incredibly fast. And we developed a way of working which gave us all the marks in one 3-minute etch. I don't know if anyone here is an etcher, but etching is a very, very, actually, can we go back to that one? Time-consuming process. I wanted to make etchings that were white lines only and would show this chemical explosion that was going on in the brain. So this is the drawing, and then here is the etching that I made from it. And the light comes back through from the paper to suggest the consciousness of the person. And here's another one. So we experimented with a lot of chemical reactions on the surface of the plate, but the technical stuff isn't as interesting as me being very pleased. And I call this series of works brainscapes. There are 30 of them, and they are each an individual portrait. It's very sort of abstract portraiture. They're the series of portraits of the patients I've drawn on the operating table, intimate portraits of their minds in action. And this is me inside a plastic bag. It's because I'm working with a very toxic material called aquatint, and I got a bit fed up of thinking about the brain all the time, and I wanted to make a piece of work that put my mark on it. I wanted to say, okay, the brain's this, I'm looking at all the neuroscience, but what does it really mean? We're going the wrong way. It's going forward on its own, how dare it. And so Nigel put me in a plastic bag. With Stanley, we'll talk about Stanley in a minute. There's a piece of work. Then, a few months ago, I was lucky enough to work with another master printer. If you're in a printmaker, collaboration is a very interesting way of working. The ideas are bigger than you. This is a most extraordinary man called Stanley Jones, who's been working as a lithographer since the 1950s, and has worked with some of the greatest artists in Britain, including Henry Moore, Liz Frink, Paula Rego, and David Hockney. Stanley saw my work for the first time a few months ago, and he said to me, I think I could do something with you. And when I met Paula Rego, and I interviewed her for a radio program I was making, she said, oh yes, I remember Stanley. He came up to me once and he said, I think I could do something with you. So, but the truth is that Stanley has approached and worked with the most extraordinary number of artists, not all of them just printmakers, and there's an extraordinary collection at the Tate Gallery of some of the lithographs he's made. So I arrived at the Cohen studio. I had Arts Council funding, bless them, to make one print, and I stayed there for 2 months and made 15. Lithography was an art form I'd never used before. It's the most painterly of ways of drawing for artists. And here is how I was working. You draw on something called drafting film, which, because I'm really bad in my emails, I was called dafting film, which I think is quite a nice concept. And you draw, and it gets put onto a metal plate, and then the metal plate goes through a huge press as long as this room, and out the other end, after a lot of toing and froing, come a marvellous set of prints. One of the things I wanted to experiment with in this project I was doing with Stanley is called Reassembling the Self. The project is about mainly about schizophrenia, but it's also about how your body is part of your identity, how your makeup, whether you get ill, whether you keep well, whether you're beautiful, whether you're ugly, whether you are tall or small. These are all the information we have in our bodies. And I wanted to make a series of work that questioned identity. These are two beautiful, you can't see them very well, beautiful pieces of work in the Hunterian Museum in London called the Evelyn Tables. And they're 16th century pieces of wood that someone has taken the arteries, or some of the arteries, out of the human body and stuck them in a very painterly, rather naive way onto these big pieces of wood to sort of try and understand how the arteries of the body work. And I just thought they were beautiful, so I thought I'd try and make a contemporary piece of work like that. So that's in the Cohen studio, there it is on the dafting film. And this is the piece of work that we made from that. This is human size, and I've mixed up anatomy. As you see, the brain is somewhere down where the womb might be. I've put ears where the heart might be, and I've also put photographs of people in there, because I want to sort of question, ask the questions to the public through making the work that I ask myself. How are we ourselves? This is another piece of work that is upstairs in this exhibition. Again, it's got an ear bone on one side, it's got a hip bone for a shoulder, it's got a sort of heart in the wrong place, it's got the head in the right place, and I suppose most of my pictures always do. This piece of work came about because I was working in the Hunterian Museum drawing the bones of the inner ear, which is so small. There are 3 of them, they're smaller than your little finger nail, in my bit one even smaller. And there's the Professor Standring, who's the anatomist there, came over to me. She was talking to me about these bones. And they're so small, these bones, they're in your ear, that when someone shouts at you, your eardrum moves, and these bones just gently rock away so that they don't get damaged. And I was so overwhelmed by the sort of beauty of this, I suddenly thought, for a very bad moment, that the idea of evolution suddenly seemed bonkers to me in a moment. I mean, of course I believe in evolution, but suddenly it was easier to believe that some very, very clever God had designed us to make these little tiny bones that bent over when someone shouted at you, than to believe that evolution is clever enough to do it. But actually, I don't really believe that. It's just one of those moments. All these sort of thoughts feed into my work. So it's drawing as muse, it's thinking as muse. This picture again is upstairs. It's again called Reassembling the Self. I then focused on schizophrenia, and this is a rather grim, though I don't know why I think he looks a bit Scottish. No offence, I just think he's got a kilt on. But I don't know why. He's made up, as you can see, from completely odd body parts, but he still has a sort of human connection. And schizophrenia is concerned a lot with hearing voices. And I put these there because I feel that if one had 7 or 8 different voices going on in your head at any one time, it would be very, very hard to be yourself. So this is part of the explanation of that work. This is a lithograph. Again, at the studio they call this piece of work ear bottom, because as you see, instead of an arse, it's got a very large pair of ears. So Stanley and I were having a lot of fun, as well as me making, playing God as it were, and making new human beings. Also technically, the process of what's going on here, the way the ink hangs on, the way we've used very, very small bits of very gentle colour, it's very technical, very exciting, and I'm very, very pleased with these works, because process is one of my other muses. And there is our Scottish guy with mauve in the background. I put black in the background. Stanley said it's not right, we've got to use mauve, and I said I cannot use that word. I cannot use that colour in my work, but he made me do it, and he was right. And somehow I think it should be a poster for Macbeth. So I've got the brain, I've got work collaborating and process as something I do a lot of, and now I've got science. I've got a residency at the moment at Newcastle University working with neuroscientists who looking at schizophrenia and what might be going on in the brain in schizophrenia. This is an image. All these interneurons form this lovely, slightly heart-like shape. They found that they connect with each other by doing a big Mexican wave. And actually, sometimes that's how it feels to me when I'm thinking. Something starts at the back of my mind, not that clear a thought as you can imagine. And I sometimes, you sort of feel it wafting across. So I decided to make a series of faux scientific pieces. These are called Birth of a Thought. They're etchings again, using white lines, which is a sort of rather radical way that I use etching. And to me, they look like they're science, but actually they're purely imaginative pieces about how I imagine thoughts build up in my head. There's a load of donuts breaking out of that thought. It must have been hungry there. So I do find on a more serious note, contemporary neuroscience is very interesting both academically and philosophically. It seems to me to be offering us a very materialistic version of who we are, and I think it's incredibly important in philosophical discussions about human identity to think about what neuroscience knows about the brain. It is also very, very visual. Scanning techniques mean that artists have access to living brains and to what's going on in the brain. And those scans, I think, one of the things I make a lot of work about is the relationship between a brain scan and what it really shows. It seems to me brain scans seem to promise to show interiority, the person, but actually what they only show is the structure and sometimes a bit of function of the brain. So it's all to do with, for me, trying to sort of find a sense of understanding of what my sense of self means in relation to my brain and my whole body. Paul Brox again wrote in a catalogue for me once, the harder one stares into the machine of the brain, the starker the realization there is no one in there. He's no Cartesian. And this is another piece of work I made when I absolutely had enough about thinking about the brain. I've undergone a number of brain scans myself to make this work. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. This is a real brain scan, and I've put the imagination at work inside it. So the question is, you know, what would my brain scan really look like if it could show me thinking? Dreadful, I should think. Shaming. So now we have philosophy as muse. As I said very briefly, I studied philosophy before I studied fine art. The relationship between the self and the brain is certain to me. You know, that's all it is. But I made this life-size pair of Ghosts in the Machine. René Descartes has this idea that the physical body and the soul are made out of two different materials, and he talks about the ghost in the machine. Your soul is housed in your body, and these are obviously, they're ghosts in the machine, but they are obviously anatomical ghosts. So they're anti-Descartian statues. I've never thought of that before, it's quite good. So they're deliberately material. And here is a piece that goes back to my Catholic upbringing again, but it's showing again the crucifix and, you know, two disciples on the side that are material rather. So, you know, it's a question about religion. So we're getting on to our half hour, won't be too long. The other thing I'm terribly passionate about is working with people. This is a project I did with a series of people with Alzheimer's, and this is a photograph by an artist called Deborah Padfield, and she's sewn me and the lady together on our hands. She's a very good photographer. My interest is in the narrative of people who have something affecting their brain that seems to affect their sense of who they are. So I've worked with Alzheimer's, I've worked with epilepsy, I've worked with schizophrenia, and then trying to meld the narratives of the science, the neuroscience, and the human experience is something I do a lot in my work. This is a poem by Philip Larkin, which I really love, in which he says, our flesh surrounds us with its own decisions. We've no idea when we're going to be born or when we're going to die. And I think it's quite a profound statement. This is a series of etchings I did of 3 people with Alzheimer's, and they're going to be in Robert's Coming of Age show, which is in
31st of May.
And this piece of work, it's made with photographic images. You can only just see the person. And as we go through the 3 portraits, they fade, so they become, in the end, there's just an eye. And I'm sure most of us have been touched by Alzheimer's, and you know what I'm talking about, the way that they're called dissolution. The personality seems to dissolve. I feel very political about Alzheimer's, but that's another talk another time. I was commissioned in 2009 to make a series of works about epilepsy by guys in St Thomas's Hospital. And again, I wanted to mix together the science, the personal experience, and the medicalisation of it as well. So first of all, I started off exploring the electricity. I made a series of pictures about electricity. Epilepsy has to do with patterns of electrical charges in the brain. It can be witnessed as EEGs, a brain scan that shows electrical patterns. So these are taken from 19th century particle photography of electric movement, and I just started with that. And then I started working with 3 different people with epilepsy to blend these scientific and personal narratives, and more importantly, to just try and make a piece of work that showed. I wanted to make a portrait which explored identity. The lady in this portrait was worried because of the very potent epilepsy medication she had to take that she could never have a baby, and that's why I've put her face in her womb. In fact, she's had a baby, so it's, you know, it's a great story now. This lady was very worried that epilepsy would stop her career as an actress, and she never told any lovers that she had epilepsy because she thought they wouldn't love her anymore. So I put her face in her heart. And I worked with a dear friend of mine, Max, who's here tonight. And Max I've known for years. I've never talked to him about his epilepsy, and I felt that this portrait is a portrait about friendship in many ways, because you can know someone for years and not know anything about them. Max is a fantastic writer, and this is something he wrote about epilepsy. If you're blind, you don't have blindness. If you've got a cold, you've got a cold, you are not cold. I have got epilepsy and I'm epileptic. It's a constituent part of me in the same way as if I'd been born with one leg. Max was writing a book about the Magna Carta when I was making the portrait of him. And I took thousands of photographs of him, and this was the one that I felt captured both a sense of identity and a sense of him in contemplation. And it's not a photograph probably that his mother or girlfriend would choose of him, and some people feel it's very slightly like a death mask. For me, it's a man in contemplation. It's a man who's very involved with their brain. And the portrait itself is very sort of heraldic and brings in all sorts of different elements. And these 3 portraits, which are very radical, are going to be shown at the National Portrait Gallery in 2013, which I'm really thrilled at, partly because they are quite radical. It is an assault and an insult to everything I would like to think of myself, says Max. I can't therefore say that my brain and myself are identical. I have to say that my brain wipes my sense of self clean. So when I'm working with people, their narratives about how they understand themselves is very important. And it all feeds into my work. The other work I'm going to whiz through quickly, I made a series of still works, some lenticulars they're called, which move when you look at them. And these were made to try and show the electricity that goes through the brain, so that when people are looking at them, they can just see. Someone else described it to me like this: it is not a momentary lack of consciousness. It is like a momentary lack of consciousness, not for long. It's not a total loss of consciousness. You don't faint, you don't drop to the floor, you just stay the same. It's just that your mind goes blank for a millisecond, and then you regain consciousness in a way. And that's what these works were about, a millisecond. I've been commissioned to make, then I was commissioned to make a series of works about the heart. It's a difficult subject, the heart. There's so many imagery about it. The heart is a romantic heart. It's a sacred Catholic heart. It's always drawn in a particular shape. And I wanted to make it a series of work about a beating object. To me, the heartbeat of the heart is the interesting thing. In a healthy animal, insect, human being, anything with a heart, it beats for 1 billion times in your lifetime. Obviously, it depends how fast it beats, how long you live. And I thought that fact was great. So this series of work move when you walk past them, and as I say, they're about the beating heart. I've got to keep up with my tricksiness there. I forgot you were doing it. So I settled on a simple circle to represent the heart in the middle, and strong colour is used to suggest the fact that the heart is the space in the body where the emotions are traditionally felt. So I'll come quite near the end now to the final project which I'm working on, which is about schizophrenia. I'm working, I think I said, as artist in residence at the Institute of Neuroscience at Newcastle University. And I have unique access to patients with schizophrenia as well as to neuroscientists and clinicians. And schizophrenia is a complicated thing. The definition of it is, it's a very potent label. It's not a one thing, it's a whole range of conditions, which I'm sure we all have parts of. And the project has been to bring together many of the narratives that are to do with that. I'm working with two exceptional artists who have schizophrenia, and this is a picture by Camille of how she feels it's stolen her life. And I think it's a strong, wonderful portrait. She says, I look at the garden, but I don't see it as I normally do. I can only concentrate on details. For instance, I lose myself in looking at a bird on a branch. I don't see anything else. So one of the things they think about perception is that you, in schizophrenia, is you get like a tunnel vision, and you cannot edit it into the wider world, so that everything seems to have huge significance, a bit like a religious experience. I've been experimenting with something called eye tracking, which is drawing with your eyes. The computer fixes on your pupils, and it was a way of trying to, again, my love of process, trying to make some pictures that could explore the sense of self through no intervention of the hands, just with so these are self-portraits, as you can see. This is my really best one. So, I think I'm going to stop now. It's been 33 minutes, and I think it's probably enough. The talk has been about trying to explain the sort of things that inspire me to work. The last 10 years have been a huge intellectual and process-led journey for me as an artist. And I've taken my work into new and different media to explore the ideas about consciousness. I'm really, really curious, and the mistakes I made, that's my other muse, is my mistakes, because the mistakes seem to me nearly more interesting than anything that goes in the right direction. And this, to me, was a mistake. It doesn't look like me, but the work that's coming out of it is really, really exciting. And I'd like to finish with a lovely quote by Nigel Oxley, my great mentor and etcher, and he just says this: what if? The question what if, spoken by Susan Aldworth, has marked the start of her many etchings and now monoprints. The work exploits the chance alchemy of purpose and process, of method and material. What if becomes action. The resulting image is a record of rehearsed chance and embodies one more methodical adventure. Inevitably, after discussing this new image, the question is, what if? Thank you.